The fine was supposed to silence him. $25,000. But Elijah Brown didn't flinch. He'd been here before. Not this exact courtroom, but others just like it. He'd sat through zoning board meetings, council sessions, backroom conversations whispered behind closed doors. He knew how power moved. Quietly, confidently, often without question. But nothing quite prepared him for what took place that morning in Courtroom 6B of the Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama. The room wasn't crowded, but the atmosphere felt razor-sharp. Elijah stood at the defendant's table dressed in a well-worn charcoal suit, one that had seen protests, community gatherings, even a few funerals. His tie was tight, shoes polished. Beside him, his attorney looked uneasy, fingers drumming the table in a slow, nervous rhythm. Up on the bench sat Judge Raymond Lasker, mid-60s, white, with a face carved from stone. Known for his no-nonsense demeanor and thin patience, especially with people who talked more than he liked. The hearing was supposed to be simple. Elijah had filed a motion to unseal a set of documents tied to the Glenfield Housing Board, files he believed held evidence of unethical evictions, discrimination, and collusion. His request was legally sound, backed by precedent, local codes, and constitutional grounds. But from the moment he began to speak, the temperature in the room changed. "I'm asking the court," Elijah began, voice steady, "to grant access to records that impact dozens of families. People who've been forced out of their homes without due process, without explanation." Judge Lasker's eyes narrowed. "You're out of order, Mr. Brown." "I said you're out of order." A ripple of whispers swept across the courtroom. A few members of the press were seated quietly in the back, pens at the ready, cameras concealed under coats. One freelance journalist arched an eyebrow. "I'm within my rights to request these records," Elijah continued, refusing to retreat. "This court has a responsibility." "Mr. Brown," the judge boomed, cutting him off mid-sentence. "You are now in contempt. A fine of $25,000 is imposed, effective immediately." Gasps filled the courtroom. Elijah's attorney stumbled to his feet. $25,000? For what? He filed a legal motion. The judge leaned back, smug. "For disrupting this court. This isn't a protest rally." Elijah said nothing at first. He stared at the judge, his face unreadable. His hand remained flat on the table. He didn't move, didn't blink, but something was burning behind his eyes. Because this wasn't about procedure. It wasn't about decorum. It was about power. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "before you close this session, I'd like something entered into the record." Judge Lasker's smile faded. "You're in no position to make demands." "I'm not demanding," Elijah replied. "I'm informing." The judge hesitated. Even his attorney sat back down, eyes wide. "I am formally invoking federal statute, Title 28, Section 455, Judicial Disqualification." A low murmur passed through the gallery. And just like that, the fight had only begun. The clerk barely looked up from her screen when Elijah approached. That wasn't a coincidence. And the more he uncovered, the more resistance he faced. One mother, Jocelyn Grant, called him in tears. She'd been evicted after a single missed rent payment, her first in 9 years. She had a letter confirming the payment had been received. It didn't matter. When Elijah went to visit her apartment 2 days later, it was already boarded up. Fresh plywood. Wet paint. He brought her case to the Glenfield Housing Board. They tossed it aside in 5 minutes, dismissed, no discussion. That's when Elijah knew this wasn't incompetence. It was strategy. A quiet, systematic purge. Clean. Legal. Hidden in paperwork. So he went public. He showed up at city council meetings. Recorded testimonies from displaced families. Filed a complaint with the Office of Fair Housing. The response? The housing board accused him of intimidation. The mayor's office stopped replying to his emails. People who once praised his advocacy now avoided him. Even his job at the school became emails, internal memos, conversations between the judge, the housing board, and a private real estate firm. It was all there. A plan to clear out tenants, redevelop the land, and turn a public housing complex into profitable commercial property. All quietly. All on paper. All by the book. Elijah knew then, this wasn't just a court hearing. It was a direct challenge to an entrenched machine, one that protected itself at all costs. Judge Raymond Lasker wasn't just another figure in a robe. He was part of the mechanism. Still, Elijah didn't blink. Because truth doesn't have to shout to be real. He backed up every document. Sent copies to Regina, a civil rights agency in D.C., and a journalist he trusted at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Just in case. So by the time he walked into courtroom 6B, he already knew the odds. He just didn't care. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about standing up and making sure someone saw what really happened, no matter how the system tried to bury it. The machine could be challenged, but the deeper Elijah dug into the housing board's actions, the darker the truth became. The folder he carried into court that morning wasn't thick, but every page counted. Among the documents was a handwritten letter from a former Glenfield employee. She'd chosen to remain anonymous, but her words were vivid and unfiltered. She described closed-door meetings where tenant names were highlighted in red ink. Those in red were labeled "prob." But the most damning communication was a forwarded email from a city council assistant to the Glenfield board. The message referenced none other than Judge Laska. It read, "Races were clear on the evictions. Just remind the team to keep it low profile. The fewer hearings, the smoother this goes." That line alone had stunned Elijah the first time he read it. A judge, tasked with impartiality, had seemingly endorsed secretive removals from behind the bench. It explained the sealed files, the lack of appeals, the fast-tracked evictions. Families like Jocelyn's never stood a chance. But accusations alone wouldn't be enough. Elijah needed evidence. That came in the form of a grainy cell phone video. Shot at a dinner party, the footage showed two housing officials in conversation. One, clearly intoxicated, laughed as the other said, "Court stuff? Don't sweat it. Ray's already handled it." Ray was Judge Laska, and that conversation took place just days before the wave of final eviction orders rolled out. Elijah didn't have wiretaps or subpoena power. What he had was persistence. He dug through public calendars, professional bios, even property records. What he uncovered was telling. Two board members had direct financial ties to the same development firm seeking to convert Glenfield into upscale condos. Layer by layer, the web unraveled. Just a sentence, motion denied. Sealed by judicial order. Signed by none other than Judge Laska. Regina was furious. He's sealing records tied directly to himself. That's a clear-cut conflict of interest. They filed an appeal. Before the date was even set, Elijah received notice. The court had summoned him, not for the appeal, but to clarify his legal standing. It was a paper-thin excuse. The hearing became a confrontation. As soon as Elijah raised concerns about judicial bias, the judge cut him off. No deliberation. No review. Just a declaration. A $25,000 fine. Contempt of court. The room froze. Regina leaned in, whispering, "We can refile. Request a new judge. Let's not push it." But Elijah was past persuasion. He reached into his case, removed the same file he'd sent to a journalist in St. Louis, and opened it on the table. He didn't tremble. He didn't raise his voice. He simply began reading. Email dated February 8th. From Glenfield Board Director Thomas Wexley to Judge Raymond Laska. Subject, update on displacements. Attached, 72 tenant notices. Pre-signed. The judge's face tightened. "I request this document be entered into the official court record," Elijah continued, "under federal regulations governing judicial conduct. The content suggests direct interference and a breach of judicial ethics." Judge Laska leaned back in his chair, face unreadable. That's when the air in the courtroom shifted. It no longer felt like a proceeding governed by law. It felt like a warning. No one said a word. 10 seconds of silence passed, heavy and tense. Not the kind born of confusion, but the kind that arrives when everyone realizes they're witnessing something they were never meant to see. Even Judge Laska faltered for a second, staring at Elijah like he was reassessing what kind of man stood before him. But it didn't take long for him to snap back into his practiced posture. "I'm ordering that statement stricken from the record," Laska declared sharply, his tone brittle and cold. "You have no authority to introduce evidence. This is not a trial." Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm not introducing it as evidence," he said calmly. "I'm reading it into the record as part of my response to the contempt charge." "You don't have that right," Laska snapped. "This is not a circus. I won't allow my courtroom to be turned into a spectacle." "This isn't a challenge," Elijah replied. "It's accountability." The way he said it, calm, plain, without drama, cut through the room like a blade. There was no performance, no outrage. Judge Laska leaned back in his chair, face unreadable. That's when the air in the courtroom shifted. It no longer felt like a proceeding governed by law. It felt like a warning. No one said a word. 10 seconds of silence passed, heavy and tense. Not the kind born of confusion, but the kind that arrives when everyone realizes they're witnessing something they were never meant to see. Even Judge Laska faltered for a second, staring at Elijah like he was reassessing what kind of man stood before him. But it didn't take long for him to snap back into his practiced posture. "I'm ordering that statement stricken from the record," Laska declared sharply, his tone brittle and cold. "You have no authority to introduce evidence. This is not a trial." Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm not introducing it as evidence," he said calmly. "I'm reading it into the record as part of my response to the contempt charge." "You don't have that right," Laska snapped. "This is not a circus. I won't allow my courtroom to be turned into a spectacle." "This isn't a challenge," Elijah replied. "It's accountability." The way he said it, calm, plain, without drama, cut through the room like a blade. There was no performance, no outrage, just truth. And that made it hit harder. Laska stared at him, and for a brief second, something flickered behind his eyes. It wasn't rage. It wasn't ego. It was hesitation. Behind Elijah, Regina Alvarez looked stunned. This wasn't the Elijah she had worked with for months. "You may want to back that up," he said. She didn't speak, but her face shifted, like she suddenly wasn't sure which side of the story she belonged to. Outside, the hallway was a hive of whispers and confusion. Reporters started dialing phones. Regina caught up with Elijah just as the heavy doors closed behind them. "You should have backed off," she said softly. "He could come after you harder now." Elijah shook his head. "He already did. And he knows it might not be enough." He pulled out his phone. 2 new emails had come in. One from the Oversight Committee. One from the journalist in St. Louis. "What do they say?" Regina asked. "They're watching." But what Elijah did next changed everything. The next morning, his inbox was overflowing, 37 unread messages. Most were from journalists. A few were from attorneys in other states asking for interviews. But 2 stood out. One was from a national civil rights organization. One message came from a public integrity group based in D.C. Another was from a retired federal judge Elijah had never met. But Regina was prepared. She escalated the matter to the chief judge of the district. While that played out, Elijah kept pushing. He met with tenant advocates at a local community center, sharing what he could, not the protected documents, but the story they told. A pattern, a motive, and proof that what happened wasn't isolated. "This isn't about me leading anything," Elijah told the group. "It's about making sure we don't fight alone." That same night, a local television station aired a segment. "Whistleblower claims court collusion in housing displacement." It was cautious, no firm conclusions, but it asked the right questions. And that was enough to make Judge Laska sweat. 2 days later, the chief judge announced a preliminary review of Laska's conduct. It wasn't disbarment. Not yet. But it was the beginning. Back in the courtroom, Laska looked changed. Not shaken exactly, but quieter, more careful. Elijah and Regina returned to the same bench. Same judge. Same room. But the mood had shifted. Laska cleared his throat. Regina filed the renewed motion with the new judge that very day. Within 72 hours, it was approved. 38 sealed files were released. Inside those documents, pre-signed eviction forms, internal memos showing coordination between developers and court officials, tenants forced out days before construction crews coincidentally arrived. No warnings. No hearings. One internal message even joked, "Make sure L's calendar is clear so we don't hit any bumps." L, meaning Laska. The theory was no longer a theory. It was fact, inked and time-stamped. Elijah sat quietly in the back row when the new presiding judge, Clarice Mendel, a black woman with a calm but commanding voice, stepped up to the bench. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't get emotional. But her words rang like a bell. "This court is initiating a formal inquiry into every Glenfield-related case processed between 2021 and 2023, she announced. "There will be accountability." Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked Elijah if he felt vindicated. He paused for a long time before answering. "Not yet," he said. "Not until the people who were hurt are finally seen." But what truly turned the tide wasn't a legal document. It was a piece of video, only 43 seconds long, shot at a fundraising. It wasn't some grand admission. No signatures on contracts, no dramatic confession. But it was real. It was unguarded. And it proved what Elijah had been insisting all along. The video hit the media 3 days after the court unsealed the Glenfield records. It wasn't part of any plan. Not Regina's, not Elijah's. Someone from within the housing authority. Someone who had been silent for far too long. Leaked it anonymously to a local news station. When it aired, everything shifted. City council members scrambled to release statements. The mayor announced an independent audit of the housing board's dealings. Blinfield's office locked up tight for 3 days, citing facility issues. One board member stepped down quietly. Another tried to deflect blame, calling the scandal a clerical misunderstanding. But the pressure didn't stop. Tenants who'd been forced out without justification started coming forward. Jocelyn Grant was one of the first. She sat in her aunt's living room, her youngest child curled up against her shoulder, and spoke to the camera. She told how she lost her home in under a week. The notice came on. He's rattled, she wrote. ETSI knew Sam's intelligence, nous restons trois pas devant. But Elijah wasn't after revenge. He had no interest in dragging Laska through the mud. He wanted repair. So that's what he focused on. He helped tenants apply for assistance. Coordinated a housing relief fund using donations that poured in after Jocelyn's story went viral. Partnered with 2 nonprofits to draft legislation. Laws that would prevent courts from sealing housing-related records without a public hearing. Still, the quiet moments weren't always calm. One evening, Elijah came home to find his mailbox torn off its hinges. Nothing stolen. Nothing spray-painted. Just gone. Another day, he got a call from a blocked number. A low voice said, "You're picking the wrong fight." Then hung up. Elijah didn't report it. He just changed his locks. Kept his head down. Kept moving. Because he understood. When you confront people used to power with no accountability, Elijah didn't show up to every hearing. He didn't need to. The movement had its own legs now. Tenant groups had organized. Lawyers were volunteering. People weren't walking into the courtroom alone anymore. Elijah spent his days differently. Less time researching legal statutes, more time building networks. Connecting families to housing advocates. Helping new organizers learn the ropes. Teaching renters how to access their own public records. So they wouldn't be left in the dark again. One afternoon, Elijah spoke to a group of college students in Tuscaloosa. Most of them had never stepped foot in a courtroom. They'd never read a legal filing, never considered how zoning laws shaped lives. But they listened. Not because Elijah made the topic flashy, but because he made it real. "They're counting on us being too exhausted," he told them. "Too busy. Too confused. Too disconnected to fight back. But when you understand the system, when you learn the language, you're not so easy to erase." That had always been his message. And now it was catching on. Regina told him that the Department of Justice had quietly requested copies. Still, not everyone understood why he kept pushing. At a small fundraiser one evening, a man in a suit leaned over and asked, "Do you really think any of this makes a difference in the long run?" Elijah didn't get defensive. He just smiled slightly and replied, "Not everything, but enough. Because that's how change really happens. Not in one sweeping moment, but piece by piece. A sealed record open to the public. A mother who gets her home back. A judge who's no longer protected by silence. A neighborhood that starts to understand how the system works. And how to hold it accountable." That was Elijah's legacy. Not outrage, but clarity. Not vengeance, but awareness. And through that, a quieter kind of strength. One built not on power or position, but on honesty and the bravery to speak truth. Even when the room doesn't want to hear it. It didn't solve everything, but it lit a path for the next person, standing alone before a courtroom, where the outcome feels already decided. It told them, you're not imagining things. You're not powerless. You're not alone. Not anymore. If stories like Elijah's remind you that real change begins with ordinary courage, pass it on. Speak up. Know your rights. ETSI vous et jamais don un peace au quelqu'un reste silence here. Any détournes pas le regard. Restez, jusqu'à ce que la vérité soit entendue.